succeeding as a very young airmail pilot, doing what he really liked. But that wasn't going to be enough for him because in 1926, Lindbergh was only 24. He learned of a $25,000 prize being offered by a Frenchman named Ortigue, a prize that would go to the first pilots who could fly nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean between New York and Paris. It didn't matter which way they went, New York to Paris, Paris to New York, either way. But Ortigue wanted somebody to begin pioneering genuine commercial aviation. And to do that, somebody had to begin flying between population centers, in this case, New York and Paris, something nobody had ever done before. Now, 70 pilots in one way or another had already crossed the Atlantic as of 1926, but they had done so in dirigibles, or they had made stops along the way, or it wasn't between population centers. Nobody ever flown between New York and Paris before. And it was always in groups. What Ortigue wanted was somebody, he probably assumed they'd be in groups, 2 or more pilots, to actually pioneer a practical flight between New York and Paris. And that was what the prize was for. So Lindbergh heard about this proposition. It fired his imagination. And so, living in St. Louis as he was able to find some businessmen in St. Louis who were willing to put up $15,000 so that Lindbergh could find and perhaps design the kind of plane that would allow him to do the job. And from the very beginning, uniquely, he was determined to do it alone, not with a co-pilot, but alone. So as of February 1927, having just turned 25, Lindbergh was out in San Diego conferring with an outfit called the Ryan Aeronautical Company to help him design and build an aircraft for that mission. The plane, of course, that became the Spirit of St. Louis, named after Lindbergh's backers in that city where he was living. And if you look at this slide, off to the left on the tail, you can see the word Ryan. That's the company that made the plane in San Diego. And then right below Ryan, you can see NYP, which stands for New York, Paris. The thing about this plane, and Lindbergh was determined to have it so, was that there would be no excess weight. Everything would be sacrificed for fuel. There had to be enough room as possible for all the fuel the plane could practically carry. And that meant one pilot. That meant only one cockpit, of course. That meant as much space for fuel as possible. Only one engine on this plane. That would also save weight that fuel could make up for. There would be gas tanks situated on the wings, one tank on the right wing, one tank on the other side of the plane. And there would also be a large tank right in front of Lindbergh in the cockpit. That is at least 3 gas tanks. And of course, the problem with that is if there's going to be a gas tank right in the cockpit in front of the pilot, Lindbergh wasn't going to be able to see much of anything in front of him on this flight across the Atlantic. But Lindbergh didn't mind. He didn't think there was going to be much up there to see anyway. So what he did, just in case there would be any problem at all, was design or allow for a little periscope, as you see here in this design, that would be right in front of him that he could peer into in case he thought there was anything up there to see. Something that you won't see on this slide is a radio. Lindbergh thought that would be too heavy. So he was going to be up in the sky over the Atlantic with no radio, no means to communicate with anybody. Not only no radio, no parachute. That he also thought would take up too much weight. And instead of a nice, comfortable pilot's chair made of leather, in order to make the chair as light as possible, Lindbergh insisted that it be made of wicker. And after saving all this space and all this weight, that meant that he was able to provide for at least a 4,000-mile trip, which was very good for Lindbergh because he had gone to the San Diego Public Library and he had used his trigonometry skills that he'd learned in the Army Air Corps. And then he took a little piece of white string and with all of his knowledge put together, he was able to plot a flight from New York to Paris that he thought would take 3,500 miles, leaving a nice 500-mile cushion for him should he need it. The fact was, however, that what Lindbergh was planning to do was a very dangerous proposition. This Ortigue Prize had been around a while. Others had tried to earn it. People had died trying to earn it. That very May of 1927, as the Spirit of St. Louis was just about ready to go. The Frenchman Charles Lindbergh, who had won 43 aerial combats against the Germans in World War I, took off from Paris with his friend Francois Colli, hoping to win that $25,000 if the two of them could just get to New York. And they were never seen again. They simply disappeared. But Lindbergh was going to try it, and he was going to try it alone. By then, by that May 1927, much of the world knew about this project, knew about Lindbergh's plans. He was beginning to become very widely known, even before the flight. He flew the Spirit of St. Louis all the way from San Diego to Roosevelt Field outside of New York. What a lot of people forget about that flight in the spring of 1927 was he set a new transcontinental speed record on a plane in that flight. Of course, he had to stop a bunch of times, but he still got between coasts faster than anybody had ever gotten. But once he got to Roosevelt Field on Long Island, unfortunately for him, the weather proved to be very bad. And it stayed terrible for several days. There would be no takeoff for a while, not by Lindbergh, nor by Richard Byrd, who was there at the same place in the same time, thinking that maybe he could make his own attempt, although he would have a co-pilot if the weather would just clear. The papers began calling Lindbergh the flying fool. And on the night before the weather finally promised to clear, the night before Lindbergh thought he might actually try to take off, on May 19th, the night before the day of the takeoff, Lindbergh was in his hotel room in Manhattan trying to sleep. He did the best he could. He couldn't sleep a wink. He was up at 2:30 a.m. on May 20th, and by 5 a.m., the light drizzle that had occupied the morning had stopped as Lindbergh was out on Roosevelt Field getting ready for the flight. Luckily for him, Byrd was not ready. Lindbergh was, and he would have the chance to earn the prize. As a crowd gathered at Roosevelt Field, the light began to promise a better day. And at 7:30 a.m., they loaded up 451 gallons of gasoline on the Spirit of St. Louis, which weighed more than the rest of the plane combined, including the body of the pilot himself, Charles Lindbergh, not to mention the 5 sandwiches that he was going to take to keep him not too hungry on the way from New York to Paris, if all went well. Fox Movie Corporation was there to film the whole thing using a brand new technology by which they could unite sound and vision, a technology called Movietone. That would, in fact, soon become famous in the newsreels. This was now going to be a very famous event indeed. And almost at the last moment, before Lindbergh began to take off, one woman from the crowd burst over to the Spirit of St. Louis and offered him a little kitten to take across the Atlantic as maybe a good luck charm, which I think quite sensibly Lindbergh refused. At 7:51, he started the engine. Then, little by little, off the ground he went, and then back down to the ground he went as the crowd anxiously looked on, the Spirit of St. Louis running through some puddles on the landing strip. And then for a second time, the plane rose a little bit in the air, and for a second time, it came back down. Would he be able to take off at all? He wasn't going to give up now. The plane took off a third time, and this time it stayed in the air, just missing a group of wires at the other end of the runway. And now the Spirit of St. Louis was airborne on the morning of May 20th, 1927.